I'm not pretty, the poor Omega whispered. The Alpha King replied, That fine I need honestly not fancy. The lone Alpha watched the scarred woman drag timber through the snow, and every instinct screamed she was trouble. An exile marked by fire, cast out by her own pack, building a cabin that wouldn't survive the coming storm. She turned her scarred face away, waiting for the Alpha to flinch like all the others, but his golden eyes didn't waver. I'm not pretty, she whispered, the words heavy with every rejection she'd endured since the fire, and his response shattered everything she thought she knew about alphas. Good. Pretty breaks are easy in these mountains. I need honesty, not fancy. But what this exiled wolf didn't know was that trusting him would lead to the most brutal betrayal of her life. His cousin was already circling, ready to make her pay for daring to build a life alone. In front of the entire pack, when he'd have to choose between her and everything he'd built. Chapter 1. The Meeting. The woman dragged a fallen pine through the frosted clearing, her breath rising white and ghostly in the dying light. Winter crept closer with every passing hour, its cold fingers already brushing against the mountains that ringed the valley like ancient sentinels. Her palms bled where the rough rope bit into skin, crimson streaking against hemp, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The air smelled of snow and iron, the sharp metallic tang that always preceded change. Celine had learned to read the signs over her years of exile, the way the birds fled south in hurried flocks, their wings beating frantically against the coming cold. The silence that settled over the forest like a held breath, as if the trees themselves were bracing for impact. The heaviness in her chest that spoke of storms both natural and otherwise. The animals had already retreated to their dens, smart creatures knowing when to hide. She wasn't smart, or perhaps she was too stubborn to be smart anymore. From the ridge above, Jacob watched her. His black mare stood perfectly still beneath him, only her ears twitching at the sound of the woman's labored grunts below. He'd been tracking the scent of fresh-cut wood for days, curious about who would be foolish or desperate enough to build alone this deep in the wilderness, this far from pack protection, this close to winter's deadly embrace. She was small, human in shape, but something in the way her muscles flexed beneath her torn coat carried the rhythm of the pack. Determined, untamed, familiar, yet not. Her movements were efficient, practiced, the kind of economy of motion that came from having no one to rely on but yourself. No wasted energy, no unnecessary flourishes, just survival, stripped down to its barest bones. He nudged the mare forward, descending slowly. His boots crunched against the frost, announcing his presence intentionally. Surprising a lone wolf rarely ended well. The half-built cabin loomed skeletal against the storm-dark sky. 4 walls, no roof, gaps between the logs that would whistle with wind come the first real snow. No scent of another wolf anywhere in the clearing. No fresh tracks save hers, circling the structure again and again like a prayer or a curse. She was alone. Completely, utterly alone. That's a lot of work for one, Jacob said, his voice low and edged with the natural dominance of an alpha. Not threatening, just stating fact, the kind of observation that invited conversation without demanding it. She turned sharply, rope still gripped in both hands, gray eyes fierce and wary. Her stance shifted in an instant, not quite aggressive but defensive. Ready. One hand moved instinctively toward the hunting knife at her belt, fingers hovering near the worn handle. Don't need charity from strangers. Her voice was rougher than he'd expected, shaped by smoke and screaming, by long silences and longer nights. A voice that had forgotten how to ask for help because help had stopped coming long ago. He caught the wind then, drawing her scent deep into his lungs. It told stories his eyes couldn't see. Burnt wood and salt tears, old fear wrapped around older grief, and beneath it all, the unmistakable mark of exile. She'd been cast out, shunned, made into nothing by wolves who should have protected her. His jaw tightened with recognition. He knew that scent. I knew what it meant. Roof won't last a moon without proper bracing, he said, nodding toward her cabin, keeping his voice neutral and practical. Storm's coming. Big one. You can feel it in your bones. I'll manage. Her chin lifted, pride hardening her features into something almost fierce. It was the pride of someone who'd had everything else stripped away, who had nothing left to lose except the thin dignity of self-reliance. He stepped closer, studying her with the kind of attention most people had stopped giving her months ago. A pale scar slashed from temple to jaw, puckered and shiny. Old burn, badly healed, the kind that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than accident. The damaged skin pulled at the corner of her mouth slightly, giving her face an asymmetry that would have been considered beautiful had it been symmetrical, was still striking in its fierce honesty. She noticed his gaze and turned her face away slightly, an instinctive movement born of shame, of too many disgusted looks, too many whispered comments, too many people who couldn't see past the surface to what lay beneath. Burns? He asked quietly, without judgment, without pity, just acknowledgement of what was plainly visible. She flinched as though struck, her whole body going rigid. I'm not pretty, she whispered, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 cruel judgments, echoes of voices that had called her cursed, ruined, unmarriageable, unlovable. She expected him to sneer, to turn away, to mount his horse and ride back to whatever comfortable life he'd left behind, confirming what others had already decided about her worth. Jacob's golden eyes softened, and something in his weathered face shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Good, he said simply, the word dropping like a stone into still water. Pretty breaks easy in these mountains. Pretty doesn't survive the first hard winter. I need honest, not fancy. She blinked, surprised, her defensive posture faltering for just a moment. Wolves sensed honesty by instinct. It thrummed in the blood, resonated in the bones, sang in the spaces between heartbeats, and his words rang true. No mockery hiding behind false kindness, no pity masquerading as compassion. Just truth, plain and unadorned. What's your name? He asked, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. Celine, she said quietly, the word almost lost to the wind that had begun to pick up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Of no pack. The last part was said with bitter finality, the kind of statement that closed doors rather than opened them. He nodded once, understanding more than she'd said, reading the story written in her stance, her scars, her solitary clearing far from the territories where pack wolves gathered. Jacob, lone alpha, I run the southern ridge. He gestured toward her struggling shelter, toward the gaps that would kill her once the real cold settled in. If you'll let me, I'll help you raise your den before the snows come. No obligation, no expectations. She hesitated, weighing his aura, the kind of strength that could crush or protect, destroy or defend, depending entirely on the character of the man who wielded it. She'd known alphas before, had been bound to one, married to one, nearly killed by one. The title alone was enough to make her want to run. But winter was coming, and she was so very tired of being alone. I can pay in labor, she said finally, her voice steadier now, negotiating from a position of pride if not power. I cook, I mend, I can work. Fair enough, he said, picking up her hammer with ease, testing its weight, checking the handle for soundness. His hands were scarred, she noticed, the kind of scars that came from work, not war. Calloused and strong and honest. We start at first light. He didn't wait for further agreement, didn't press for gratitude or submission. He simply examined her pile of lumber, mentally calculating what would be needed, what was missing, what could be improvised. Then he mounted his mare and turned toward the darkening forest. When he disappeared into the pines, his broad shoulders swallowed by shadow and distance, Celine's hands trembled. She looked at the cabin, her cabin, built by her hands, bought with her blood and sweat and tears. First snow in 2 weeks, maybe less if the wind kept rising. First help in 6 months. First hope in longer than she could remember. She wasn't sure which scared her more, the vulnerability of accepting assistance, or the loneliness of refusing it. That night, she lay in her bedroll beneath the stars, the half-finished cabin offering no shelter yet, and tried to convince herself she hadn't made a terrible mistake. Tried to ignore the small, fragile thing unfurling in her chest that felt dangerously like trust. Above her, the moon watched in silence, keeping its own counsel about the fates of broken wolves who dared to build again. Chapter 2. Sharing the Past. By the next moonrise, Jacob returned as promised. Celine had boiled bitter coffee over her meager fire, the smell mixing with wood smoke and pine sap, creating an aroma that was somehow both harsh and comforting. She watched him approach through the morning mist, still uncertain whether to trust the quiet strength he carried like a second skin, still waiting for the moment when he'd reveal his true motives, when the kindness would curdle into expectation or demand. But he simply dismounted, tied his mare where she could graze, and crouched near her tools, examining them with the careful attention of someone who understood that tools told stories about their owners. Everything was neat, resourceful, deliberate, evidence of someone who'd learned to survive without help, who'd had to make do with whatever could be scavenged or traded for or built from scratch. "You do good work," he murmured, running a calloused thumb along the handle of her handmade chisel, feeling where she'd shaped it to fit her smaller grip, noting the precision of the edge she'd honed against river stones. "Taught myself," Celine said, pouring coffee into 2 dented tin cups, the only cups she owned. Steam rose between them like ghosts. "After the last pack turned on me, after they decided I was more useful gone than present." Jacob accepted the coffee without comment, wrapping his large hands around the small cup, letting the silence stretch. He'd learned long ago that some stories couldn't be rushed. They emerged only when the teller felt safe enough to speak, when the words had been held so long they had to escape or poison the holder from within. They worked through the morning, measuring, cutting, fitting, and the rhythm of shared labor created its own language. He lifted what she couldn't, she measured what he rushed. Between the sound of axes and the whisper of wind through pine, something began to take shape beyond the cabin itself. At midday they rested. Celine had laid out bread and dried meat, simple fare but honestly offered. They ate in comfortable silence, and then, as if the silence itself had given her permission, she began to speak. "Why live out here alone?" Jacob finally asked, the question gentle but direct. Celine stared into the fire she'd built for cooking, flames reflecting in her gray eyes, making them look molten and old. "They're Alpha, my mate, burned in the fight he started." Her tone was cold, carefully controlled, but her fingers trembled near the scar on her face, touching it unconsciously the way one might touch a wound that had never quite healed. He challenged a neighboring Alpha over territory that wasn't worth fighting for, over pride that should have been swallowed. He was drunk on power and cheap whiskey, and he died screaming. She paused, and Jacob waited. "They buried him as a hero," she continued, her voice going hollow. "Called me a witch. Cursed. Said my fire destroyed him, that I brought darkness to the pack, that the moon herself had turned her face from me." She laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter sound of old wounds reopened. Never mind that he'd held my face in the coals 2 weeks before. Never mind the bruises I hid or the fear I carried like stones in my pockets. He was Alpha, so he was right. And it was convenient, so I was guilty. Her hands clenched into fists. So I left. I decided to build my own home where no one could tell me what I was, where no one could decide my worth based on my usefulness, or my face, or my ability to submit without question. Jacob said nothing, just listened. It was a rare gift, an Alpha who didn't need to fill every silence with his own voice, who didn't need to dominate the conversation the way most dominants dominated everything else. "What about you?" she asked, turning the question back on him, meeting his eyes with a directness that most wolves wouldn't dare with an alpha. Why does a lone alpha live alone? That's practically unheard of. Alphas collect packs like humans collect coins. He was quiet for a long moment, watching embers spiral upward into the clean morning air, watching smoke signals that spelled out stories he'd tried to forget. I had a mate once, he said finally, the words coming slowly, painfully, like pulling arrows from flesh. Beautiful, loved by all, perfect in every way the pack measures perfection. Graceful, charming, knew exactly what to say and when to say it. His jaw tightened, muscle jumping beneath skin. But beauty doesn't make loyalty. Grace doesn't make honesty. She died giving birth to a child that wasn't mine, and half the pack knew it before I did. They'd been hiding it, protecting her, pitying me behind closed doors while smiling to my face. Celine's breath caught. That kind of betrayal would destroy most alphas. The shame of being cuckolded, the rage of being made a fool, the violation of every pack law and personal bond. I'm sorry, she whispered, and meant it. Don't be. His voice carried no bitterness, only a bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying grief too long. I mourned what I thought I had, not what was real. Mourned the illusion, the pretty picture I'd painted in my head of what an alpha's life should look like. But the reality? That was poison dressed in silk. He looked at her directly then, his golden eyes clear. Now I run the ridge alone. Wolves circle me for power, for position, for the chance to claim alpha status through me. Beautiful females parade past, hoping to catch my eye, hoping to be chosen. But none for truth. None for what actually matters. They want the title, not the person. Understanding passed between them like a current, like recognition of a shared wound, a shared understanding that the world often valued appearance over substance, performance over authenticity. Then this arrangement? Celine began, needing to name it, to define it before it could define her. Practical, Jacob finished, his tone firm but not unkind. You need shelter. I need honesty. Need to be around someone who doesn't want anything from me except what I can actually give. The storm will test both, the shelter and the honesty. They shook hands across the fire, two scars meeting under a bruised sky, two exiles finding unexpected common ground, two wolves who'd been burned learning to trust warmth again. Over the following days, their labor moved like instinct. Hammer and claw, silence and breath, the rhythm of work becoming its own language. He lifted what she couldn't. She measured what he rushed. Between the sound of axes and the whisper of wind through pine, something primal and unnamed began to grow. They didn't speak of it, didn't name it. But it was there nonetheless, in the way he steadied the beam without being asked, in the way she poured his coffee before her own, in the careful distance they maintained that was somehow more intimate than touching, more honest than any declaration. She learned the way he took his coffee, black, strong, hot enough to burn. He learned that she hummed while she worked, old songs in a language he didn't recognize, melodies that spoke of homes long lost and hopes carefully guarded. By the fifth day, the walls were sound, chinked against wind and weather. The roof beams were set, strong enough to hold against the heavy snows that would come. The cabin began to look less like desperation and more like home, less like a last resort and more like a choice, a stand, a declaration that she had every right to exist in this space she'd claimed. And on the sixth day, as they were fitting the door into its frame, the first snow began to fall. Just a few flakes at first, drifting lazily from a gray sky. But both of them could feel it in their bones. This was just the beginning. The real storm was gathering its strength in the high peaks, preparing to descend with all the fury of winter's first true assault. Jacob looked at the sky, then at the cabin, calculating. We need to finish the roof, he said. Today, if that storm hits before we're sealed in, all this work is for nothing. Celine nodded, already moving, already gathering materials. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, racing against the coming storm, their breath forming clouds in the rapidly cooling air. The snow fell heavier, faster, coating their shoulders and hair with white. When the last shingle was nailed into place, when the last gap was sealed, they stood back and looked at what they'd built. A cabin, small but solid, honest. "Thank you," Celine said quietly. Jacob nodded. "I should head back before the storm gets worse." But even as he said it, the wind picked up with a howl that sounded like wolves crying, and the snow began to fall so thick they could barely see the tree line. They both knew the truth. He wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight. Maybe not for days. Chapter 3. The blizzard snow clawed at the cabin walls, shrieking like spirits of wolves long dead, like the voices of ancestors crying warnings or curses, or simply howling their existence into the void. What had begun as gentle flurries became a howling blizzard within hours, transforming the world into a white void where sky and earth merged into one endless, frozen scream that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Inside, Celine and Jacob were trapped. The storm had descended with such ferocity that stepping outside would mean death, disorientation, freezing, being lost mere feet from shelter. 3 nights ago, the storm raged. 3 nights, Alpha and Exile were bound by the same fire, both too proud to admit they needed its warmth, needed each other's presence to keep the darkness at bay, and needed the simple comfort of not being alone when the world outside had become actively hostile. Their breaths mingled as they worked by firelight, mending tack, weaving rope, sorting supplies, sharpening tools. Small tasks to keep hands busy and minds from wandering into dangerous territory. Her fingers brushed his as she passed him tools, and this time, she didn't flinch. This time, the contact sent a different kind of shiver down her spine, not fear, but awareness, a recognition of warmth and proximity, and the simple reality of bodies sharing space. The cabin creaked under the wind's assault, timbers groaning like old bones. Snow found every crack, every gap they'd missed, dusting the floor in white powder that melted near the fire into small puddles they had to mop up with rags. Jacob reinforced the door with an extra beam, bracing it against the wind that threatened to tear it from its hinges. Celine stuffed rags into the worst gaps, her fingers going numb despite the fire's warmth. They moved around each other with increasing ease, a dance neither had choreographed but both somehow knew, learning each other's rhythms and patterns and the small spaces where they fit together. "Tell me something," Celine said on the second night, breaking hours of comfortable silence. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Why help me? Really? You could have just observed and ridden on. You owed me nothing." Jacob looked up from the leather strap he was repairing, his hands stilling. "Because you didn't ask," he said simply. "Everyone else wants something from an alpha. Protection, status, power, legitimacy, a claim to glory by association. You just wanted to be left alone. You weren't trying to use me or manipulate me or gain anything from me." He smiled faintly. "That's the first honest thing I've encountered in years. Maybe ever." "Loneliness is honest?" She tilted her head, genuinely curious. "Loneliness chosen is more honest than company forced," he said. "Loneliness chosen means you'd rather be alone with truth than surrounded by lies. That takes courage most wolves don't have." She considered this, watching firelight play across his weathered features, highlighting the lines that spoke of hard choices and harder consequences. Gray threaded his dark hair at the temples, silver against black. Scars marked his hands, the evidence of a life spent fighting, building, surviving, refusing to break even when breaking would have been easier. He wasn't handsome in the way her first mate had been, all sharp charm and easy smiles, and the kind of beauty that knew its own power and wielded it like a weapon. Jacob's appeal was quieter, deeper, like bedrock beneath soil, like the foundations of mountains, not flashy, but utterly reliable, the kind of strength you could build a life on if you were brave enough to try. "I'm glad you came," she admitted softly. the words costing her more than they should have, vulnerability being a currency she'd learned not to spend lightly. His golden eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, understanding, the fragile beginning of something that had no name yet. "So am I." The wind howled, rattling the shutters they'd barred against the storm's fury. Somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked and fell, the sound like thunder, like the world breaking, like everything familiar being reshaped by forces beyond control. The fire burned low. Jacob added more wood, and sparks spiraled upward, dancing like tiny stars, like hope made visible. On the third night, exhaustion finally conquered weariness. They'd pushed the simple cot closer to the fire, sharing the space and the single wool blanket Celine owned. No impropriety, just survival, just warmth, just the simple animal need for heat in the face of killing cold. But when her shoulder pressed against his arm, neither pulled away. When her breathing evened and deepened into sleep, he remained carefully still, afraid to disturb her rest, afraid to break whatever fragile thing was forming between them. She'd pulled out her water-stained book earlier, the one luxury she'd carried from her old life, pages rippled and worn from being read and reread in the long nights of exile. The cover was cracked leather, the title barely legible. "Read to me?" she asked, her voice small in the way that told him this was a gift she was offering, a piece of vulnerability she didn't share lightly. "I'm not good with words," Jacob warned, taking the book with hands more used to axes than pages. "Not educated like pack scholars. I stumbled. You're better than you think, and I don't need perfection. I just need your voice." So he read haltingly, his deep voice stumbling over syllables, shaping the old tale of wolves and gods into something sacred through the simple act of trying. The story spoke of creation, of the first pack, of how wolves learned to love not through dominance but through choice, through the deliberate decision to stand beside another, not because hierarchy demanded it, but because the heart chose it. Celine's eyes grew heavy. His voice was a rumble, steady and sure despite his protests, despite his stumbles. Safe. Somewhere between one sentence and the next, she drifted, her head coming to rest against his shoulder, with a trust that made his breath catch. When Jacob noticed her breathing had evened into sleep, he stopped reading. Her dark hair had fallen across her scarred cheek, and very gently, without thinking, he brushed it back. The scar tissue was rough beneath his fingertips, a landscape of old pain made permanent. He sat perfectly still, afraid to wake her, afraid to break whatever fragile thing was forming between them. This unnamed connection that felt more real than anything he'd experienced in his entire carefully constructed life as an alpha. Outside, the storm raged on, screaming its fury at the audacity of these two wolves who dared to find warmth in the midst of winter's assault. Inside, for the first time in years, the lone alpha felt something other than cold, something other than the hollow performance of strength. He realized with something like wonder, like he'd come home.
Chapter 4. Trapped Nights. Celine woke up screaming. Fire filled her vision, orange and red and hungry, consuming everything, everyone, burning away the world she'd known and replacing it with nothing but pain and smoke and the smell of her own flesh charring. Hands grabbed at her, holding her down while flames licked closer. She could smell burning hair, burning skin, could hear her own voice begging, pleading, promising anything if he would just stop, if he would just let her go. She could feel the searing agony as his hands, her mate's hands, her alpha's hands, the hands that had promised protection, pressed her face into the coals of the pack fire while the others watched, while the others did nothing, while the pack chose their alpha over justice and her screams over intervention. "Celine!" Jacob's voice cut through the nightmare like a blade through cloth, rumbling soft and low. The tone an alpha used to steady his pack, to ground the lost, to call the frightened home, to remind the broken that they still had shape and form, and the right to exist. You're safe. He's gone. He's dead, and you're here and you're safe. She shivered violently, eyes wild, chest heaving, still half lost in memory, still feeling phantom heat against her face, still smelling smoke that wasn't there. The cabin walls pressed in. The fire in the hearth became the fire from her past, became the weapon that had scarred her, became the tool of her torture. Her breath came in ragged gasps, too fast, heading toward panic. Jacob crouched beside her, careful to keep space between them, letting her see his hands. Open, empty, non-threatening, palms up in a gesture of peace. "Breathe with me," he said quietly, his voice steady as stone. "In, out. You're here. You're in your cabin. You're safe. In, out." He breathed with exaggerated slowness, modelling the rhythm, giving her something to anchor to. Slowly, painfully, Celine's breathing steadied. The present bled back into focus. Rough wood walls, not burning canvas. A contained hearth fire, not wild destruction. Jacob's golden eyes full of concern, not her dead mate's cruel smile, not the pack's judgment. "I still feel his hands," she whispered, shame colouring her voice, making it small and broken. "The fire, the weight of them holding me down, the smell. I hate that I'm still afraid of something that's long dead and buried. I hate that he still has this power over me." Jacob's jaw tightened, muscle jumping, rage flickering through his eyes. Old, deep, controlled. The kind of rage that came from recognizing cruelty, from understanding what it meant to be betrayed by someone who should have protected you. But he didn't move toward her, didn't crowd her space, didn't let his anger become another thing she had to manage or fear. "He held you in the fire?" Jacob's voice was very quiet, very controlled, but something dangerous moved beneath the surface. She nodded, touching her scar unconsciously, fingers tracing the familiar landscape of puckered skin. Punishment. For questioning him in front of the pack. He'd made a bad call about winter supplies, and I said so. And he... She swallowed hard. "He said I needed to learn my place, that beauty was obedience, that a mate should reflect her alpha's will without question, that my face should remind me every day what happened to wolves who forgot their position."
Her laugh was broken glass, sharp enough to cut. Ironic that the lesson he taught made me too ugly to look at, made me unmarriageable, unmateable, useless for the only purposes a female wolf was supposed to serve. The pack said the fire was my curse manifesting, that I'd brought it on myself, that my disobedience had literally burned us all. Rage flickered through Jacob's eyes again, hotter this time, and his hands clenched into fists before he deliberately relaxed them. "If he weren't already dead," he said quietly, each word carefully measured, "I'd kill him myself, slowly, and I'd make sure every wolf in your old pack watched." "Don't." Celine met his gaze, her gray eyes fierce despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "Don't make him worth more anger than he's already taken. Don't give him more of your energy, more of your time, more of anything. He's had enough, more than enough." They sat in heavy silence. Outside, wind continued its assault, but the storm was weakening, the howls becoming whimpers. Inside, the fire crackled, and shadows danced on walls built against the cold. "When my mate died," Jacob said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with confession, "I felt relief. It made me hate myself for years. What kind of alpha feels relief when his mate dies? What kind of male doesn't mourn? I thought there was something wrong with me, something broken and shameful." He stared at his hands, at the scars there, at the evidence of a life spent building and breaking and building again. The pack mourned her like she was a saint, beautiful, charming, perfect. And I stood there feeling nothing but relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to smile through another day of being made a fool. Celine looked at him, really looked, past the strength, past the dominance, to the guilt he carried like stones in his pockets, to the shame he'd never spoken aloud. "That doesn't make you weak," she said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "Doesn't it?" His golden eyes met hers, vulnerable in a way alphas were never supposed to be. "No." She shifted closer, just slightly, her hand reaching out to hover near his before settling gently on his forearm. "It makes you honest. She hurt you, betrayed you in the worst way possible. You're allowed to feel relief that the pain ended. You're allowed to grieve what you thought you had without mourning what was actually real. Those are different things." Jacob's breath caught, and she saw something shift in his expression. Permission, perhaps, to feel what he'd been feeling all along without the burden of shame. "Then maybe," Jacob said slowly, meeting her eyes, "it doesn't make you weak either, to still carry fear, to still fight nightmares, to still be affected by what he did. Trauma isn't weakness, Celine. Surviving it is strength." Her breath caught. No one had ever said that, had ever suggested that her fear was anything other than failure, weakness, proof of the curse they claimed she carried, evidence that she was broken beyond repair. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words carried the weight of years, of all the times she'd needed to hear them and hadn't. They sat together as the storm raged, two wolves scarred by different fires, learning that even broken beasts could share warmth without burning, could trust again without being destroyed, could build something new from the ashes of what had been taken from them. Eventually, tentatively, Celine leaned back against the wall near him. Not touching, but close. Close enough that she could feel his steadiness, his solid presence, the warmth that radiated from him like a banked fire, controlled, reliable, safe. "Tell me something good," she said, needing to replace the nightmare images with something better, something clean. "Something from before. Something that made you happy." Jacob thought for a moment, reaching back through years of performance and duty to find something genuine. "My mother used to make bread every Sunday. The whole den smelled like honey and yeast, like home. She'd let me punch down the dough, said I had good strong hands even as a pup, and said I'd build good things with those hands if I remembered to use them gently." He smiled faintly at the memory. "I'd forgotten that. Forgot that she saw gentleness in me, not just strength." Celine smiled, softer now, the nightmare fading in the warmth of shared memories. "I used to collect wildflowers. My grandmother taught me their names, their uses. Told me that pretty things could also be powerful, that beauty and strength weren't opposites." She touched her scar again, but this time without shame, just acknowledgement. "I still believe that, just differently now. Beauty isn't about symmetry or perfection, it's about the truth. About surviving and still finding reasons to plant flowers." "Pretty and powerful aren't opposites," Jacob said, watching her face in the firelight. "No," Celine agreed. "I suppose they're not." Dawn came slowly, the storm finally exhausting itself. When pale light filtered through the cracks, Celine stirred, realizing she'd fallen asleep on Jacob's shoulder while he read to her again, his deep voice shaping words into something sacred, into a bridge between nightmare and morning. He hadn't moved until dawn, hadn't disturbed her rest, had simply sat there, holding vigil, offering the silent protection of presence without expectation. She pulled back slowly, and he stretched stiff muscles without complaint. "You smell like pine smoke," she whispered without thinking, still half asleep, her guard down in the vulnerable space between dreams and waking. "And home." Jacob went very still. Then, carefully, like someone handling something precious and breakable, he smiled. "You are home," he said quietly. And in the clean morning light, with the storm finally breaking, they both understood that something had shifted between them, something fragile but real, something that deserved protection and care and the courage to nurture rather than destroy. Chapter 5. Betrayal at Elkridge. Hollow outside, snow gleamed like bone under the risen sun, brilliant and blinding. And in it, carved deep and deliberate, were tracks. Fresh. Recent enough that the edges were still sharp, not softened by wind or new snow. Circling the den in patterns too purposeful to be accidental, too calculated to be innocent. Jacob's instincts sharpened instantly, every sense coming alert. His body shifted subtly into the defensive posture of an alpha whose territory had been violated. "We've been watched," he growled, crouching to examine the prints more closely. 3 different wolves. Large, male, territorial. The tracks told stories. Aggression in the depth of the prints, confidence in their spacing, intent in their pattern. Celine's eyes began to glow silver, the wolf rising close to the surface, responding to threat with the instincts that had kept her alive through exile. "Pritchard," she said, the name bitter on her tongue, tasting of ash and old fear. "The merchant alpha from the valley. He's been hunting me since I left my old pack. He doesn't like loose ends." "Why?" Jacob straightened, his golden eyes scanning the tree line, looking for watchers. "He made an offer after my mate died. Said he'd restore my honor by taking me as his second mate. Said he'd overlook my disfigurement out of the goodness of his heart." Her lip curled in disgust. "Wanted me grateful, pliant, willing to accept scraps and call them mercy. When I refused, when I had the audacity to say no to an alpha, he swore he'd see me driven out of every territory until I had nowhere left to go, until I came crawling back and begged for his generous offer." Jacob's hands clenched. "He has no claim on you. Claim doesn't matter to men like him. Only power does. Only the ability to enforce his will." She looked at the tracks, at the clear message they represented. "He's telling me he knows where I am, that he can reach me anytime he wants." By the next moon, when the trails were finally passable again, when the snow had melted enough to allow travel, Celine refused to hide any longer. "If he wants to shame me, let him do it to my face," she said, strapping on her worn coat with grim determination, her jaw set in a line Jacob was beginning to recognize. "I'm tired of running, tired of letting fear make my choices for me." They rode together to Elkridge Hollow, the border town where pack territories met and mingled, where wolves and humans lived in uneasy proximity. It was neutral ground, a place where wolves and humans traded, settled disputes, and witnessed the enforcement of pack law. The kind of place where public judgment carried weight, where reputation was currency, where being shamed meant being exiled not just from one pack, but from civilized wolf society entirely. The humans whispered as they passed, their conversations falling to murmurs, their eyes tracking the scarred woman and the lone alpha with avid curiosity. Wolves turned their heads, eyes narrowing, recognizing Celine, remembering her story, or the version of her story they'd been told. Everyone knew Celine's story. Everyone had already judged, already decided what she was worth, already determined her guilt or innocence based on appearances and rumors rather than truth. At the chapel steps stood Gabriel, beta of the Northern Pack, Jacob's own cousin, though they'd not spoken in years, not since the scandal with Jacob's mate, not since Jacob had chosen exile over the pity and whispers of pack life. Beside Gabriel stood Pritchard, the merchant alpha, smug beneath his expensive furs and false piety, his eyes gleaming with anticipated victory. "Brother Jacob," Gabriel said coldly, his voice carrying the weight of law and tradition, the authority of one who stood as judge and enforcer of pack codes. "You break the code by sheltering an exile without pack consent. That woman is cursed. Her fire destroyed her mate. Her alpha. She brings darkness wherever she goes. This is known." The crowd pressed in, wolves and humans both, hungry for scandal, for drama, for someone else's pain to distract from their own small lives, their own failures, their own fears. This was entertainment, judgment, the reinforcement of social order through public humiliation. Pritchard stepped forward, his smile a serpent's, all cold-blooded satisfaction. Celine, my offer still stands. Return under my claim. Save what's left of your name. I'm willing to overlook your Teresa disfigurement. In the interest of mercy, in the interest of pack unity, you could still be useful in your way. Celine's hands clenched at her sides, but she stood tall, refusing to cower, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. I'd rather burn again than belong to you, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the crowd. Pritchard's eyes flashed with anger, quickly masked. Strong words for someone with nowhere to go. For someone who should be grateful, anyone would offer her shelter at all. Jacob felt it then. The pressure, the weight of expectation, the eyes of the pack on him, measuring, judging, waiting to see what he would do. As a lone alpha, his position was already precarious. Defending an exile could cost him everything: his territory, his standing, his future, whatever small respect he'd managed to maintain. The practical voice in his head calculated rapidly. If he stood with her, he'd be labeled. Shamed. Possibly challenged. If he distanced himself, maintained that this was purely transactional, he could walk away clean. Could preserve what little status he had left. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Self-preservation overriding truth. Fear overwhelming the fragile courage he'd been building. She's just work, Jacob heard himself say, his voice flat, distant. Temporary help. Nothing more. The air itself seemed to recoil. The world went silent. Celine froze. Her silver eyes found him, and in them he saw the exact moment the fragile bond they'd built turned to ash. The exact moment trust transformed into betrayal. The exact moment hope became just another lie she'd been foolish enough to believe. Just work. Temporary. Nothing. The words hung in the air like smoke, like poison, like the final confirmation of every fear she'd ever carried about allowing herself to trust again. Pritchard's smirk widened, victory gleaming in his expression, satisfaction in his posture. You see? Even if he knows what you are, exile. Even an alpha desperate enough to live alone won't claim you. Even charity has limits. Gabriel nodded, satisfied, the matter resolved to his satisfaction. Then there's no violation. Jacob, you're wise to keep proper distance. The code is maintained. Order is preserved. The crowd murmured approval. Heads nodded. Order restored. Hierarchy maintained. The proper people were properly shamed. The proper people properly protected. Everything as it should be. Celine turned and walked away. No howl, no tears, no dramatic exit. Just silence sharp as claws, cutting deeper than any blade, heavy as stone, final as death. Her shoulders were straight, her head up, but Jacob could see the way her hands trembled, could see the fracture he'd just created, could see exactly what he'd just destroyed. Gabriel nodded to him, satisfied. You're learning wisdom, cousin. Sometimes we must be practical. Jacob stood frozen, feeling every ounce of what he'd just lost, feeling the weight of his cowardice settling on his shoulders like wet snow, cold and heavy and suffocating. He'd chosen fear over truth, chosen appearance over honor, chosen the approval of wolves he didn't even respect over the trust of the only person who'd been honest with him in years. Again. He'd done it again. When they returned to the cabin hours later, after the crowd had dispersed, after Pritchard had ridden away victorious, after Gabriel had clapped Jacob on the shoulder with approval he didn't want, the ride had been silent as a grave. Celine dismounted mechanically, her movements distant, controlled, empty of all the warmth that had been building between them. The den's finished, she said, voice flat and empty, carved hollow by betrayal. So is the bond. Leave, Alpha. I should have known better than to trust one of your kind. Should have remembered that alphas protect themselves first, last, always. The door closed behind her like judgment, like finality, like the sound of something irreplaceable breaking. Jacob stayed in the snow, staring at the cabin they'd built together, watching smoke rise from the chimney he'd helped raise, seeing the walls they'd sealed against the storm, remembering the nights they'd shared stories, and the morning she'd said he smelled like home. And for the second time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose something real by protecting something worthless, to sacrifice truth for appearance, to choose cowardice over courage and call it practical wisdom. The ride back to his own den was the longest of his life. Chapter 6. Hollow Days. The ridge was cold. Jacob sat in his own den, larger than Celine's, better built, filled with the trappings of an alpha's life, and felt nothing but emptiness. The fire burned, the walls stood strong, but the warmth didn't reach his bones. He stared into whiskey and memories, watching both blur together. His dead mate's face, Celine's scarred one, the way he'd flinched from truth twice now, choosing pride and propriety over the only real connections he'd ever known. Coward. The word echoed in his mind, in his own voice, relentless and true. He'd told himself he was protecting her, that claiming her publicly would only make her a target, would paint her with the same scandal that followed him. But that was a lie, and he knew it. He'd protected himself, his position, his fragile pride. The days dragged past, hollow and gray. He went through the motions, patrolled his territory, managed his lands, met with the few pack members who still acknowledged his authority, but it was mechanical. Empty. At night, he dreamed of her voice reading from that water-stained book, of her head on his shoulder, of the way she'd whispered, "You smell like home in the blue hour of dawn." He'd had home. He'd built it with his own hands, and he'd thrown it away with his own words. On the 7th night, Elder Duncan appeared at his door. The wandering Omega was ancient, gray-muzzled, bent with age. He spoke for no pack, followed no alpha, answered only to the moon and his own conscience. "You look like rot," Duncan said without preamble, inviting himself inside. Jacob didn't argue. It was probably true. The old wolf settled near the fire, accepting the whiskey Jacob poured. "That woman built more with broken bones than you have with all your strength," Duncan said. Jacob said nothing. What was there to say? "Your first mate wanted pretty," Duncan continued, his voice like gravel and wind. "Wanted the appearance of strength, the image of power. This one wanted the truth." He fixed Jacob with eyes that had seen too much, lived too long. "You'll lose both if you keep worshipping appearances instead of substance. Go to her, or the next moon will rise on your grave." "She won't forgive me." "Maybe not." Duncan shrugged. "But forgiveness isn't the point. The truth is, you owe her truth even if it costs you everything." "I already tried the truth," Jacob said bitterly. "It got me betrayal and a bastard child that wasn't mine." "No." Duncan's voice sharpened. "You tried to trust someone who didn't deserve it. That's different. Celine deserves it. The question is whether you're a wolf enough to give it." The old Omega stood, joints creaking. "The ancestors are watching, pup. What you do next determines whether you're remembered as an alpha or just another coward who wore the title." He left Jacob alone with the silence and the truth. For a long time, Jacob sat unmoving. Then, slowly, he rose. He walked to the small shrine he kept, the place where he honored his ancestors, the wolves who'd built his line, who'd held territory through honor and strength. He knelt before their stones and spoke aloud the confession burning in his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for mistaking pride for honor, for calling truth shame, for protecting my name instead of protecting what mattered." His voice cracked. "Teach me to be better. Teach me to be worthy of what I've been given." The fire crackled. The wind answered. And in the silence, Jacob felt something shift. Not forgiveness, but possibility. The faint, fragile chance of redemption. He rose before dawn, saddled his black mare, and rode. Toward truth. Toward fear. Toward the only home that had ever mattered. Chapter 7. Public Confession. The full moon gathering was sacred. Every pack within 3 territories sent representatives, witnesses to laws upheld and disputes settled. It was where alphas proved their worth, where justice was witnessed, where the old ways were honored. Jacob stood before them all. The elders sat in judgment. Gabriel was there, coldly curious. Pritchard watched with barely concealed amusement. Even the humans from Elkridge Hollow had come, sensing drama. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to stay silent, to protect his position, to preserve what little status he still held. He ignored them all. "I'm here to confess," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Not to ask forgiveness from the pack, but to speak truth before the moon and all who witness." Silence fell like snow. "I am a coward," Jacob continued, each word costing him. "I stood in Elkridge Hollow and called an honest woman just work to protect my own pride. I betrayed someone who'd shown me more honor in a season than this pack has shown in years." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. "You speak of the exile." "I speak of Celine," Jacob said firmly, "who was cast out not for curse or crime, but for surviving a mate who burned her for disobedience, who built a home with bleeding hands when all of you turned your backs." His voice rose. "She is worth 10 of your so-called pureblood alphas. Judge me instead." The crowd erupted in whispers. An alpha publicly shaming himself was unheard of. It violated every code of dominance and hierarchy. Elder Duncan stepped forward, his ancient face unreadable. "You claim she has honor?" "I claim she has the truth," Jacob said, "and I claim I failed to match it." "Then you forfeit your standing," Gabriel said coldly. "An alpha who cannot maintain authority." "I don't want authority built on lies," Jacob interrupted. "I want a pack built on truth, and if that costs me everything, so be it." He turned and walked away from the gathering, from the status, from the hollow pride that had poisoned his life for too long. Behind him, the whispers grew to shouts. Some called him mad, others called him weak. But Elder Duncan smiled, and in the shadows at the edge of the gathering, several younger wolves watched with something like hope in their eyes. Celine was fixing the last shingles of her roof when hoofbeats broke the quiet. She didn't look down when Jacob appeared, just kept working, driving nails with methodical precision. He climbed the ladder without asking, without permission, picked up the second hammer, and began to work beside her. They worked in silence. The only sound was the rhythmic strike of hammers, the creak of wood settling, the whisper of wind through pine. When the last shingle was in place, they sat together on the ridge of the roof, breathing hard, looking out over the silver mountains. "I told them everything," Jacob said finally. "Told them I was a coward. Told them you were the only one who built something real while they built monuments to their own pride." Celine didn't answer, didn't look at him. "I'm not good with words," Jacob continued, his voice raw and honest. "But I'm trying to be good with my heart." He paused. "I failed you. I chose fear when you deserved courage. And I'm sorry." The moon rose high, washing their faces in silver light. "Why now?" Celine asked quietly. "Because Duncan told me I'd die alone if I kept choosing pride over truth, and because—" Jacob's voice caught. "Because the ridge is cold without you. Because whiskey doesn't taste like your coffee. Because I'd rather live honestly and alone than be comfortable and lying." Celine finally turned to look at him. His golden eyes were steady, no pretense, no performance, just the truth. "You hurt me," she said simply. "I know. You made me believe I could trust again. Then you proved I couldn't." "I know. So what do you want from me, Jacob?" He met her gaze fully. "A chance. Not forgiveness. I haven't earned that. Just a chance to prove that I can be the man you saw in me before I proved otherwise." The wind whispered through the pines. The cabin stood solid beneath them, built by 4 hands, 2 hearts, 1 fragile hope. "One chance," Celine said finally. "But Jacob?" "I know," he said. "If I fail you again, we're done." I understand. She nodded slowly. Then get off my roof, Alpha. We have work to do. And for the first time in weeks, Jacob smiled. Chapter 8. Reconciliation. The moon hung full and silver, painting the world in shades of pearl and shadow. Jacob stood before Celine in the clearing outside the cabin, snowmelt dripping from the eaves, the first promises of spring humming in the air. What are you asking? Celine's voice was steady, though her pulse thrummed beneath her skin. Jacob stood before her, moonlight silvering the edges of his weathered face, highlighting the gray in his hair and the scars on his hands. Let me build a life with you. Not dominance, not possession, just the truth. She studied him, really studied him. The lines around his eyes that spoke of hard winters and harder choices, the strength in his shoulders that came from work, not posturing. The honesty in his golden eyes that she'd learned to trust again, carefully, painfully. I don't need rescuing, she said. I know. His voice softened. But I wouldn't mind a partner. Equal share. Equal say. Your name on this land alongside mine. He extended his hand. Deal? This time, when their hands met, Celine felt no fear, no hesitation, only the weight of something sacred, something chosen rather than forced. When he pulled her close, his gaze asked the question his words couldn't. She nodded, giving permission. Their first kiss was gentle, hesitant, perfect, not claiming but promising. His hands cradled her face, thumbs gentle against her scarred cheek. Her fingers tangled in his shirt, holding him close but not caging him. When they parted, both were breathing hard. Yes, Celine whispered. Yes to partnership. Yes to the truth. Yes to you. Jacob's smile was brighter than the moon. But then Celine's head lifted sharply, her wolf senses catching something in the wind. What is it? Jacob asked, immediately alert. She turned toward the ridge. Riders. Moments later, wagons appeared through the trees, not armed for battle but laden with lumber, food, tools, and supplies. Families emerged, wolves and humans both, the same ones who had turned their backs, who had whispered and judged. Now they came bearing shame and goodwill. Even Gabriel, the beta who had accused her in Elkridge Hollow, dismounted and bowed his head. I was wrong, he said simply. We were wrong. Jacob's words, they challenged us, made us look at what we'd done. And Pritchard, once the cruel merchant Alpha, avoided her eyes entirely as he laid his hammer among the supplies. His pride was broken, his smugness gone. They came to build your barn, Jacob said softly, wondering in his voice. Our barn, Celine corrected, a quiet smile forming. For days the clearing filled with voices, laughter, hammer strikes, and song. The pack rebuilt what pride had broken, not just the structure, but the bonds, the community, the understanding that strength came from honesty, not hierarchy. Children played at the forest edge. Women shared bread and stories. Men worked alongside Jacob, treating him not as a lone alpha to be feared or courted, but as an equal. And Celine, for the first time since her exile, felt it, belonging. Not as someone's possession or someone's shame, but as herself, scarred and strong and seen. Chapter 9. Spring and Forever. By the time spring truly broke across Moonridge, the snow had melted into streams that sang through the valley. Inside their finished cabin, sunlight spilled across the floorboards Jacob had laid himself, warming wood and skin alike. He sat half asleep in the chair beside the hearth, exhausted from a morning spent repairing winter damage to the barn. Celine watched him with something between awe and peace. This man, this alpha, who had chosen truth over title, heart over hierarchy. He stirred, feeling her gaze. Morning. Afternoon, actually, she replied, with warmth in her tone. They cooked together. Venison stew with wild herbs Celine had gathered, bread Jacob was learning to make from his mother's half-remembered recipe. They worked together, planted together. carrots and beans in neat rows, wildflowers at the edges, her touch, her color returning to the world. At midday, hoofbeats announced a visitor. Pritchard appeared on horseback, hat literally in hand. His scent was different now, regret and humility replacing the smugness that had once defined him. "Miss Celine." "Alpha Jacob," he said formally. "I came to apologize. I misjudged. I was cruel." Celine met his gaze evenly, without fear, without anger. "No," she said calmly. "You judged exactly what you could see. You just never looked deeper." "I hope there are no hard feelings," he offered. "There aren't," she said simply. "But there's no business either. Good day, Pritchard." The man bowed and left, stripped of all the power that gossip and fear had once given him. That evening, the valley glowed with golden light. The air hummed with spring's promise, new growth, new possibilities, new life. They sat together on the porch Jacob had built, watching the world come alive again. "Marry me," Jacob said quietly, the words simple and true. Celine turned to him, surprised. "When you're ready," he continued. "Could be tomorrow. Could be years. I'm not going anywhere." She smiled, reaching for his hand. "Ask me again when the wildflowers bloom. I want to say yes when the world's alive again." "Deal," Jacob said, bringing her knuckles to his lips. They sat in easy silence, watching the sun melt behind the mountains, the new barn casting long shadows over fertile ground. "You know," Jacob said at last, "you're beautiful." Celine touched her scar, not hiding it, just tracing its familiar shape. "I'm scarred." He shook his head, golden eyes soft. "Same thing. Scars mean you survived. Survived and built something anyway. That's the most beautiful thing I know." Night fell gently. The cabin's windows glowed with firelight, the kind that warms, not burns, the kind that illuminates rather than destroys. In the meadow below, the first wildflowers pushed through thawed soil, small, stubborn, brilliant, yellow and purple and white, painting the brown earth with color. Pretty fades, fancy breaks, but honesty endures. Under the patient watch of the mountains, beneath the blessing of the moon, the Alpha and the Scarred One built not just a home, but a new way, one forged in truth, bound by choice, and tempered by fire. And when the full moon rose, its silver light found them on the porch, hand in hand, hearts steady, ready for whatever storms the next season might bring. Together, equal, free. The end.